Now, Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson, currently running for governor, was just caught mailing checks to people who had actually died during the Cold War. But of course, now he blames others for this mistake. Now, Bob Ferguson, Washington State's current Attorney General and the Democrat Party's leading contender to be Washington State's next governor in 2024, he's been embroiled in his Tuna voter bribe check scandal now for over a month. Apparently, Ferguson wanted to demonstrate to the people of Washington State just how competent a Ferguson administration would be in the governor's mansion. So he sends checks from Bob Ferguson himself, his name is on every single one of them, to thousands of dead people, some of whom died during the Cold War. Now, for my public school viewers, the Cold War officially ended in 1991, although for those of us alive at the time, the Berlin Wall coming down in Germany in 1989 really seemed like the end, at least it did to me. But regardless, Bob Ferguson sent checks to people who died as long ago as 1966, and to a lot of people who died in the 1980s. So let's just get into even more details about this kind of unfolding scandal where Ferguson, he sees dead people everywhere, and he attempts to bribe them, presumably in an effort to capture the Grateful Dead vote. And now that he has been caught, he attempts to blame other people for the circus drama that he has created. And this is the second video I produced on Ferguson's Tuna check dead voter bribe scandal. And I've actually linked to the first video in the video description below. However, it may be really impossible for me to adequately explain just how screwed up the Ferguson administration has been at the Attorney General's office, and how even simple tasks can be turned into epic fiascos when you put this guy in charge. Now, it really is impossible to predict just what circus drama these guys are going to fumble into next. But we can predict with really a high level of confidence that when you elect clowns to office, government usually turns into a circus. And Ferguson is the ringmaster of this one. There really is nobody else to blame. He was personally responsible for shaking down the canned tuna and chicken businesses, who then paid the state $40 million just to leave him alone. And presumably, the canned tuna crew colluded to increase the cost of canned tuna and chicken sometime between 2010 and 2013. But then Ferguson, at his sole discretion and direction, invented an imaginary class of people who should get this kind of cash stash that he extorted from these businesses. Now, keep in mind, this class of people, it's a class, is when a bunch of people, they get together and say they should all get this money. That has nothing to do, actually, with chicken or tuna. Ferguson just invented a list of 400,000 people to send these checks to. In what probably seemed like a Queen's Gambit level move by Ferguson, the self-proclaimed chess master himself, he decided to time the release of these tuna checks to voters, living or not, in an effort to kind of make sure that they know Ferguson is their sugar daddy, just in time for the 2024 election. Now, Ferguson made this personal and a self-promotion effort by putting his name on every single check and every single letter. His name is signed on the envelope, it's everywhere. And he wanted his name all over every one in an effort to kind of save his political campaign the expensive costs of voter outreach. By using the tuna check excuse, Ferguson could then outsource the cost of his voter outreach efforts to the state and, of course, have the taxpayer pick up his bill. Now, last week I discussed how it appears that thousands of dead people are getting these checks. At the time that I produced that video, I actually posted a copy of a check right here sent to a Federal Way man who had been dead 23 years, and he died in 2001, 9 years even before the evil tuna price fixing scandal is supposed to have happened. Now, after that, I was just flooded with more examples of dead people getting Ferguson's tuna voter bribe checks. And here's an example of somebody who died in 1991, 19 years before the canned tuna prices were actually fixed. Now, then I, of course, found more dead people who died during the Reagan administration in the 1980s, back when the Cold War was in full swing and Ferguson was still in high school. Of course, to add insult to incompetence, Ferguson even sent a check to Republican State Party Chair and 19th Legislative District Representative Jim Walsh's deceased wife. She had tragically died in a very well-publicized car accident in 2022. Now, of course, that's who Bob Ferguson sends these checks to. Now, as this unfolding kind of fiasco of government incompetence continues to get more attention, Bob Ferguson has been doing what every clown in government does when they get caught: shift the blame to somebody else. In this case, Ferguson claims that Experian, a credit monitoring company, produced the list, and so it must be their fault, of course. Even a chess master knows that you have to misdirect when you screw up so badly. So blaming the vendor is kind of viewed as this grandmaster move for sure. Now, as anybody who has even an entry level of experience in creating mailing lists knows, this Ferguson-invented Experian list is unbelievably stupid and botched. A pro tip for Ferguson: maybe just get a copy of the voter list from the Secretary of State and then kind of start with that list. Now, sure, it's of course also filled with dead or missing people, but even that botched list is probably more accurate than what this fiasco has exposed. I mean, why did Ferguson even use Experian in the first place? Well, maybe this was a corporation and he chose it because they were fined $3 million in 2017 by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau for deceiving consumers about how they use their credit scores. Or maybe it was because this corporation settled a $45 million consumer action lawsuit themselves in 2009 for violating the Consumer Fair Protection Act. I mean, who really knows? Birds of a feather tend to flock together, so it will probably take a lot of records requests and sleuthing to untangle this entire fiasco. And I'm sure Bob Ferguson is already directing his employees to destroy all the incriminating evidence as I speak. After all, this is actually a habit of Ferguson's office, and it appears to be one that they've had as they execute Order 66. Ferguson's office, under his supervision, has repeatedly been caught destroying public records. So why should this time be any different? But regardless of how many records Ferguson tries to hide or how much he tries to blame somebody else for his own mistakes, he really can't hide just how botched this whole fiasco has become. And this is really more than just the thousands of dead people who got Ferguson's Tuna voter bribe checks. I mean, think about this just for a second. Theoretically, this was a settlement where the canned tuna and canned chicken companies paid Ferguson $40 million to leave them alone, supposedly because these evil corporations colluded to inflate the cost of tuna between 2010 and 2013. Now, normally, when class action cases like this are settled, a class of consumers or victimized people is identified, and those are actually the people who get the payouts for the wrongdoing. But when Bob Ferguson's involved, he doesn't even bother doing that. No, instead what he does is he invents this whole fake class of recipients. Supposedly, according to his statements, Ferguson claims that he would send these checks of either $50 to single people or $120 to heads of households who are low income. Now, there's no way to verify if they ever ate canned tuna or chicken in their lives. And really, who really cares about that? Because even though that's the reason why the lawsuit was settled in the first place. Just make sure your name, Bob Ferguson's name, is on the check. And presumably, Ferguson believes the average voter is so stupid or venal that they will just simply vote for the guy who kicks a few crumbs their way sometimes. This is Ferguson's version of the famous Roman idea of giving us peasants out here bred in circuses. So he figures that if he does that, we're going to all vote for him. So, okay, then Ferguson promptly sends checks to people who died years and even decades before this wrong ever actually happened. Decades. Even in Washington State's screwed up voter roll records, they usually actually remove somebody who died decades ago. And seriously, Bob Ferguson had to strive. I mean, he had to work exceptionally hard to find lists of people who were long, long dead, so long now, to get people to presumably bribe. Any group of random homeschoolers could actually do a far better job. Now then, after I did my last video on this subject, of course, I've been inundated with comments from people who received checks, and so has Representative Jim Walsh and others like Brandy Cruz. And I'll post just a quick sampling here. Hey, my brother received one. He's been dead for nearly 37 years. Another one. My dad passed away a few years ago and never even lived in Washington. Even my deceased dad got a check. And another one. Yes, I received one for my late husband. He's been gone at least 20 years now. Of course, here's more of them. We got one for my grandpa. He died in 1988. On Brandy Cruz's show, one guy even got one for his father who died in 1966. The comments here, they are endless. And the copies of checks are stunning, just the sheer volume that I've seen. And it's only a drop in the total bucket of how many of these checks that have probably been sent out there. There are thousands of them. Of course, even the checks that were accidentally sent to live people, many of these didn't even go to people who were remotely close to this Ferguson-invented class of low-income people. This is the group that Ferguson pretended to have sent these checks to. Here's some other quotes. My son got one and he's in the top 2%. Another one. My in-laws and friend got them and they are in the top income tier in the state. Or here's, of course, some other one. Our oldest son, who has never lived in Washington State, got one. And my nephew got a check delivered to our house. He's never actually lived in Washington. Now, there are some basic questions that people do ask, and I'm going to kind of attempt to clarify them for you here because people keep asking them. And I'll kind of give you another caution, though, before I do this right now. And I'll explain what would normally happen in Washington State when a check to a dead person is not cashed. However, I will caution you that we're in kind of a lawless time with people like Ferguson who just abuse the law every day. So he may decide to change the rules. The Democrats might decide to change the rules, and our tame judges and party hacks who kind of occupy government today, they could actually decide to do something very different. But presuming that the law is going to be followed the way it normally has been for the last century. So you got a check for your dead husband who died in the 1980s. Presumably, you don't commit fraud and you try to cash the check yourself. I don't recommend doing that, so you don't do it. After 120 days, the check is actually void, and the money goes to what's called an uncollected funds department at Washington State Department of Revenue. And if you were the heir of the estate for the dead person, you can, in theory, provide information, and this is their website here, and I'll link to it down below. And you need to provide like a copy of the death certificate and then proof that you are indeed the heir to the estate and that these funds would be released to you directly. When I actually spoke to people who've gone through this process in the past, it seems pretty painless. So you could, in theory, also go through the same process yourself. If you ripped up the check, for example, and threw it away because you thought it was a scam, and you can kind of go through that same process. Now, in this example, you could just properly identify yourself and you'd follow the process that's outlined at the website. However, if you are one of the tens of thousands of people who receive checks for complete strangers, unknown names, or for others who are not you, you would actually be committing fraud if you tried to cash that check at all. Now, it's likely if you're a Democrat or a progressive, Ferguson won't prosecute you. I mean, this is the same government crew who allowed $600 million to disappear out of the Employment Security Department just a few years ago. And nobody's really looking very hard at exactly what insider turned off those security features there. Of course, if you're a Republican, as Ferguson has demonstrated on many occasions, the rules are very different. And he'll probably prosecute you with the highest priority, and he will dedicate the agency to getting that cash back from you. Now, I'm really not sure what actually has happened here. It's obviously a fiasco, and Ferguson is clearly responsible for it. But the details have yet to be determined, and even though we're uncovering more of them, it's really worth trying to sleuth out these details. I'm sure Ferguson is just hoping that this goes away as he tries to run out the clock, just like he does when he's losing a chess match. However, regardless of what we discover, I believe that it's safe to say that it took a lot of work and effort to botch things up this badly. This, in essence, was a very simple task. And if you think Ferguson screwed up this one so royally, what do you think he's going to do if we're foolish enough to actually let him occupy the governor's mansion? Now, for years, I've defined government bureaucracy as kind of this mountain of corruption concealed by an ocean of incompetence. This seems to be the most accurate description of the administrative state that I can actually find out there, and Ferguson is proving this description as very accurate under his keen and impressive leadership. But we have to ask ourselves, is this what we want for our future? Just another corrupt politician hiding behind a smokescreen of incompetence and failure, and of course blaming others for all the problems that he basically is responsible for. I hope not. But if you don't want this guy to be governor and demonstrate that he can limbo even lower than the existing bar has been set for complete incompetence currently set by our departing Governor Inslee, then you have to engage and you have to make an impact now. Inevitably, you have to show up. Maybe use these tuna and chicken checks, the handful that actually were sent to real people out there. Use this money for something good. You can donate it to Ferguson's opposition, for example. You can donate it to a group or cause that you support. You can just buy more ammo or maybe more food, maybe some tuna and chicken. Whatever you do, it will be better spent than Ferguson's schemes ever envisioned. But regardless of how you spend it, however you have to engage and show up to make an impact, tell your friends and neighbors about your experience. Start paying attention to the clowns that we have occupying government today, and encourage your friends and neighbors and other people to engage and be involved today. It really does matter. But if you want things to change, you just can't make it happen by staying home and being unengaged. You have to show up. Because in the end, the future only belongs to those who show up. And no sane person wants our future governor to be in this guy's hand.